His Majesty would have you know that as never any king was more loving to his people, nor better affection to the right use of parliaments, so never king was more jealous of his honour, nor more sensible to the neglect and contempt of his royal rights, which his Majesty will by no means suffer to be violated by any pretended colour of parliamentary liberty, wherein his Majesty does not forget that the Parliament is his council, and therefore ought to have the liberty of a council, but he understands the difference betwixt council and controlling, and between liberty and the abuse of liberty.
The history of the English Civil War begins with the crisis of 1641 in the first year of the Long Parliament. The origin of that can be traced back into the 16th century and the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, but we must at least trace them back to the accession of Charles I in 1625. Charles I was 25 when he came to the throne, a shy and modest young man, full of good intentions, but not very clever, with a streak of stubbornness and high ideas about the duties of kings. His one friend, Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was 8 years older than he was, still very young to be his chief minister, but more sensible than many people thought. In the first 5 years of his reign, Charles I was plunged into a parliamentary crisis which was decisive for the whole history of his reign, including his death. Of all the members of Parliament whom we could take as representative figures in these tense and difficult years, two stand out: Sir Edward Coke and Sir John Eliot. They were not friends. Coke was then in his 70s, Eliot in his 30s. Coke was essentially an Elizabethan. Eliot was a Jacobean. Coke may have despised Eliot as an upstart. Certainly he is the more famous and more important man of the two, and if we dare make a moral judgment, the better man. An old church at Tittleshall in Norfolk holds, rather surprisingly, his magnificent tomb, as well as his first wife's and the first Earl of Leicester's, and many Cookes who trace their descent proudly from him. This Elizabethan Cook, the son of a Norfolk landowner, went to Norwich Grammar School, to Trinity College, Cambridge, and then to the Inner Temple and the law courts, where he came to the government's notice. He was made Speaker of the House of Commons in 1593 and Attorney General. The portrait of him at that stage of his career shows a tall, handsome man with a bluff, forthright manner, a fluent, jovial talker, a brilliant barrister, and a very able and tough Attorney General with a truly tremendous grasp of the law and a marvelously self-confident way of putting it over. He used to take notes in the law courts and record his own and other people's cases in the barbarous law French of the time. His reports became famous as soon as he began to publish them. Later, the institutes appeared, defining the law on various topics. He was so able and so vigorous in arguing the Crown's cases as Attorney General that in 1606, under James I, he was made a judge. And he was a bad judge, at least in the eyes of the government. He couldn't stand the ecclesiastical law of the church courts. He quarrelled with the Chancery. To him, the common law, though not the only law, was certainly the highest law in the land, which ought to control all the other systems of law. And he, more than anyone, made it the highest law, but not without a series of squabbles with the government. In the end, in 1616, he was dismissed. It was an extraordinary thing to dismiss a judge, but then Coke was an extraordinary judge. But it's not as a judge that he played his part in the parliaments of Charles I, where he met Eliot. Eliot, young enough to be Coke's son, was a Cornishman, a thrusting, ambitious, excitable, imaginative man with a bent for abstract philosophy, full of ideas, but in the end not very efficient. He went to Exeter College, Oxford, but there was nothing of Cook's solid learning behind him. He travelled, he was made a JP, he was knighted, he sat in Parliament as a member for his local borough, he was appointed Vice Admiral of Devon. The typical first steps of a 17th century career in the public service, which might have landed him in the end at Whitehall, in the Board of Admiralty, or as Secretary of State, if he had had better luck and more ability. In Parliament, his speeches struck fire, especially at tricky moments when cooler heads did not know what to do. It's because he and Cook were temperamentally so different that what they had in common is so significant. They played contrapuntal parts in these parliaments. Cook, with his experience and authority, would lead the way when he could see the end of the path. Eliot would chime in at desperate moments to keep the ball rolling wherever it might lead. But in the end, they both worked in the same direction. For although they were so different, they were also very alike. Both were gentlemen, and the sons of gentlemen. In other words, natural members of the top 5 or 10% of the population who called themselves the people and virtually monopolized political power and political responsibility. The political nation, we would call them. Both were Protestants, not Puritans. Both were intense nationalists and patriots, never doubting that one Englishman was worth 10 Frenchmen and that the great enemy was the King of Spain, who aimed to rule the world and make England Catholic. Both were dyed-in-the-wool royalists and monarchists, and parliamentarians at the same time. This is an important point which needs explaining. Modern democratic ideas are totally irrelevant to the 17th century. The name for the political system with which the 16th and 17th centuries, as well as earlier centuries, and the 18th century too, solved the problems of government and liberty was not democracy or limited government, or government under the rule of law, but mixed monarchy. In that system, two strands of thought run side by side. On the one hand, the king is the focus and head of everything that is done in public life. To him, every individual owes complete obedience and subjection. He governs through the law, but the law gives him great power over every subject. Your subjection makes you an Englishman, and you boast of it. And if the king tells you to go to prison, you go, with a sort of pride in your total obedience to the king's command. For you too believe the homilies appointed to be read in churches, which tell the lower classes that rebellion and disobedience is the puddle and sink of all iniquity. And it's up to you as a gentleman and governor in your locality to set an example. And on the other hand, you are proud of your liberty. You boast that you could not live without it. But it is not liberty to resist the king's commands, but in a sense to share in them in Parliament. For you are present in Parliament whether or not you sit there as a member, and indeed whether or not you have the vote. Members of Parliament were not just delegates for constituencies. They were the actual body of the whole realm in miniature. It was the whole realm that granted taxes to the king, gave advice, reported grievances, with his consent made laws. He commanded, you obeyed, because you in Parliament have given your prior consent to that command. The crucial link in this chain, it's clear, was the link between the king and the Houses of Parliament. These stiff-looking figures in the old prints were really bursting with their own importance.
We stand not in place to speak or do things pleasing. The voice of the people in the things of their knowledge is said to be as the voice of God.
That was said in James I's first Parliament, and that's why the political history of the 17th century is so largely the history of Parliament, and why all the crises were parliamentary crises. There couldn't be a crisis except in Parliament. There couldn't be a rebellion. Even the Civil War was only a conflict between the king and the Parliament carried to extreme lengths. Now, it may be that social changes over the 16th and 17th centuries had made the House of Commons richer and more assertive. It may be that social forces were at work which made a conflict inevitable. But in any case, Coke and Eliot in the parliaments of the 1620s were involved in a clash of wills over actual questions of government policy. Across the Channel, the Protestant states of Europe were involved in a great war against Spain and the Counter-Reformation, and they were losing. For 4 years, before the accession of Charles I, James I tried appeasement. The country gentlemen in the House of Commons wanted war, and they wanted victories. Coke's first important opposition speech in the Parliament of 1621 had nothing to do with the law at all. It was a long, violent diatribe against Spain, just at the moment when James I was trying for a treaty with Spain, and he went to the Tower for it. In 1625, Charles I married a Catholic French princess to get a French alliance and at last make war against Spain. It looked as if the king himself was deserting to the enemy's ideology. When the French alliance did not materialize, it looked as if the government was inefficient. When their operations against Spain failed, it almost looked as if they didn't want to win. When in desperation they launched an attack against France, which failed as badly as all their other expeditions, the frustration and excitement reminds us of the Suez crisis. It's a great mistake to think that the English country gentlemen, whether from Norfolk or Cornwall, could accept these long years, first of appeasement and then of one military disaster after another, without feeling humiliated and betrayed. And there was another quarrel that struck another tender nerve over the question of unparliamentary taxation. The basic customs duties of the 16th and 17th centuries were called tonnage and poundage. Tonnage, because the duty was so much on a ton of wine; poundage, because it was a shilling in the pound on other goods. These duties had always been voted by Parliament to every king at his accession. They were an important item in the king's revenue. But James I had imposed some additional duties without a parliamentary grant. These were called impositions. 2 parliaments had already contested them. And when in 1625 tonnage and poundage had to be voted to Charles I, the Commons wanted to vote the impositions too. That is, by voting them, they wanted to abolish them. In other words, to abolish the king's right to impose, which they thought was not a right. The point is that these parliaments were not disputing about money, but about the status of the House of Commons. They wanted to give the money. They did not want Charles to take it. If he took it, it became his right to take it. If he could take the impositions, why should he not take any tax at will? If he could take any tax at will, why should he ever summon Parliament again? For there was one flaw in the system of mixed monarchy. The Parliament had no right to sit. It ought to sit, people thought, about every 3rd year, and more often in exceptional cases or in wartime. But the law said, and everyone agreed, that the king could call and dissolve parliaments whenever he wished, and only when he wished. It was entirely up to him whether he called a parliament or not, or how long he let it sit. The question always was, would the parliament sit again? If it would, the system of mixed monarchy was secure. But in the 17th century, the whole system seemed to be in danger. If Charles I could levy taxes whenever he wanted to, there was no guarantee that Parliament would continue to exist. That's why the Parliament of 1625 wanted to grant the impositions. But Charles, too, thought that the right was as important as the money, and would not agree. And therefore the Commons refused to grant tonnage and poundage either. But Charles continued to collect the impositions and tonnage and poundage as well, so one question became 2. Coke and Eliot and their colleagues in Parliament never dreamt of attacking the king. He was so essential to the political structure that he was immune from criticism. The law said that the king could do no wrong. But the king's servants and advisers could do wrong. Buckingham could do wrong. They tried to impeach him. Then they simply demanded that Charles should dismiss him. But of course he did not. Indeed, on all these disputes, he took a very strong line, and even as a matter of political tactics, he thought it did no harm to remind the Commons of their political weakness. That was the meaning of the remark about the difference between counsel and controlling. And Charles made the same point, more bluntly, with his own mouth.
I am come here to show you your errors. Remember that parliaments are altogether in my power for their calling, sitting, and dissolution. Therefore, as I find the fruits of them good or evil, they are to continue or not to be.
Nothing could be said clearer than that. And he said the same thing in different words when he opened the Parliament of 1628.
Every man must now do according to his conscience. Wherefore, if you, as God forbid, should not do your duties in contributing what the state at this time needs, I must, in discharge of my conscience, do those things which God has put into my hands to do. Take not this as a threatening, for I scorn to threaten any but my equals, but an admonition.
But it was a threat, and the speech of a moderate member called ROUNDHEAD shows that it was taken as such.
This is the crisis of parliaments. We will know by this if parliaments live or die. If the king draw one way, the parliament another, we must all sink.
And he went on to talk about giving taxes and avoiding quarrels and breeding a trust in the king in Parliament. Good advice, but difficult to follow, especially for Eliot. The Commons were really in a dilemma. If they opposed too much, they ran the risk of being dissolved and never meeting again. If they opposed too little, they would never change the government's policy. It was Eliot who threw restraint aside at a crucial moment with an inflammatory speech that gave voice to feelings which the House had been trying to stifle.
Our insincerity and doubling in religion, our want of counsel that sacrificed our honour and our men, the insufficiency and unfaithfulness of our generals, the ignorance and corruption of our ministers. Witness the expedition to Cadiz. Why was it not achieved? It being on all hands granted seizable. When the whole army landed, why was there nothing attempted? If nothing was intended, wherefore did they land? If there was a service, why were they shipped again? Survey the court, survey the country, the church, the city, the bar, the bench, the courts, the shipping, the land, the seas. What a consumption of our ships! What destruction of our men! Witness the voyage to Algiers. Witness that of Mansfield. Witness the next. Witness that to Cadiz. Witness that to La Rochelle. Witness the last. Witness the Palatinate. Witness the Dunkirkers. Witness the Turks. If we have these enemies at home, how can we strive with those that are abroad?
It's pure rhetoric, but it opened the floodgates for a debate on foreign affairs, which was suddenly interrupted by a message from the king to stop criticizing the government and get on with voting taxes. The scene that followed has been described for us in a letter from an MP who was present to a friend in the country.
Then Sir Robert Phillips spake and mingled his words with weeping. Mr. Prynne did the same. And Sir Edward Coke, overcome by passion, seeing the desolation likely to ensue, was forced to sit down when he began to speak through the abundance of tears. Yea, the speaker in his speech could not refrain from weeping and shedding of tears. Yet some bore up in that storm and encouraged others. Sir Edmund Coke, he not knowing whether ever he should speak in this house again, there protested that the author and the cause of all those miseries was the Duke of Buckingham.
In 30, Edward III, were they then in doubt in Parliament to name men that misled the king? They accused John of Gaunt, the king's son, and Lord Latimer, and they went to the Tower for it. If we hold our tongues now, how shall we answer our duties to God and man? 7 Henry IV, Rotuli Parliamentorum, numbers 31 and 32. 11 Henry IV, the council are complained of and removed. In 4 Henry III, and 27 Edward III, and 13 Richard II, the Parliament moderated the King's prerogative. Let us palliate no longer. The Duke of Buckingham is the cause of all our miseries. That man is the grievance of grievances.
At first, Buckingham had been accused of incompetence. Now he was accused of a conspiracy to introduce arbitrary government and bring England back to popery. The Commons once again demanded his dismissal in significant words. There is a general fear of a secret working and combination to change our holy religion. The hearts of your people are full of fear of innovation and change of government. This was the beginning of the myth of the Popish plot, which was to bedevil English politics for the rest of the century, that supposed conspiracy of Jesuits, high Anglicans, and treacherous courtiers to make England Catholic and absolute at the same time. How otherwise was it possible to account for all the government's mistakes and provocations, unless traitors in high places were deliberately aiming to set King and Parliament at odds so as to ruin the Parliament first and then the King himself? Because they did grant taxes in 1628, they were allowed to meet again in 1629, but there were no concessions. Charles politely rejected the remonstrance against Buckingham. Bishops who had been accused of neo-popery were promoted, and the war went on in the old way with more defeats. Even the assassination of Buckingham by a discontented soldier who had read the remonstrance made no difference. The man who had just been made High Treasurer, Richard Weston, was a suspected papist. He was now responsible for collecting impositions and tonnage and poundage, the duties which now 3 parliaments had refused to grant. In 1629, with Buckingham out of the way, there was at last a direct confrontation with Charles I. The climax came on March the 2nd with a command from the King to adjourn. Everybody knew that he might dissolve the Parliament before the adjournment ended.
When the Speaker put the motion to adjourn, there were cries of "No." The Speaker made to rise, but some friends of Eliot held him down. Eliot made a speech accusing Weston of building on the grounds and foundations of his old master, the Duke of Buckingham. He was accusing him of treason, and he wanted to impeach him for his life. Black Rod was knocking at the locked door, but when Eliot had finished speaking, he threw his paper in the fire. But one of his friends recited it from memory.
Whoever shall bring in the innovation of religion or seek to extend popery or Arminianism shall be reputed as a capital enemy of this kingdom and commonwealth. Whoever shall advise the taking of tonnage and poundage shall be reputed a capital enemy of this kingdom and commonwealth. Whoever shall pay tonnage and poundage shall be reputed a betrayer of the liberty of this England and an enemy of the same.
The dissolution followed. There were to be no more parliaments until the King could be sure of a more dutiful one, that is, probably never. This scene was the end of parliaments until 1640, but for a rebellion in Scotland in 1638, it might have been the end of Parliament forever. Cook and his friends, Eliot and Cook and his friends were charged with high treason and imprisoned in the Tower. In the Tower, Eliot wrote books which show him to have been as strong a monarchist as Charles I. Only he kept insisting that it was essential that the monarch should work with Parliament. He had a portrait painted, dressed in his nightgown, still the bright eyes and eloquent hands, but greyer and ill. He died in the Tower in 1632. His son petitioned Charles for permission to bury him in Cornwall. The answer was, "Let Sir John Eliot's body be buried in the church of that parish where he died." Cook died 2 years later. with the king's messengers rifling his papers in case he left anything dangerous. But there were only piles of legal manuscripts, the last volumes of the Institutes. The king had won. This is the important point. The structure of mixed monarchy had been swept away, and for the next 11 years he governed peacefully and on the whole well, because rebellion and disobedience was still the puddle and sink of iniquity. Without understanding this, we cannot understand the crisis of 1641 that led to the Civil War. In that year, when the Scottish rebellion gave the Long Parliament the upper hand, future royalists and future parliamentarians could work together, Hyde and Falkland, with Pym and Hampden, because although in fact they imposed a constitutional revolution, they believed that they were only restoring and defending the ancient political structure of mixed monarchy which Charles I had destroyed in 1629.
Jack Gwilym is now appearing in You Never Can Tell at the Haymarket Theatre. That was a Rediffusion London production.